Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patricia YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Marcus Vincent and Mark Bilby, and we're going to continue our deep dive into 1 Corinthians, comparing Marcion's Apostolos with the canonical Paul that we have in our Bibles today. As always, please remember to like and subscribe to Patricia, as well as to Mark's channel, Voces Antiquae, link down in the description. Without further ado, Marcus, over to you. 1 Corinthians chapter 12.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining us for another session on 1 Corinthians. You might think we will never get through this enormously long letter, particularly in the great speed that we have taken so far. But we promise you, we will get through the letter, and the letter has an end. If the letter had been in the Marcionite version more closely to Paul, then the letter would end even a chapter earlier. But as we will see, we have 16 chapters, so coming to the last third, let's say, of the letter now. Before we start, let me just think about what I experienced when I was flying yesterday from Cologne, and had an enormously interesting partner sitting next to me, who introduced himself as coming from a small minority Christian community in Kazakhstan, and who had emigrated after the wall had come down, together with his family. His father and grandfather were preachers in this Christian community, heavily engaged, but also secluded. He talked about a kind of a bubble in which they were living, but they were pushed around from Kazakhstan to Ukraine, back from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, from Kazakhstan to the north of Russia, to Siberia, then back to Kazakhstan, to eventually escape all of that pressures and settled in Germany. Now, he was asking what I was doing, because as always, when I'm flying, I was working on my Paul. So we got to chat to each other. And it was so interesting to see how somebody from this type of a background, it's a Mennonite background, was talking about saying, well, for him and for his small community and the family, only two things really matter. One is that you obey to God, and second, that you live an ethical life accordingly. And that makes him happy. Now, when we got to talk about the two versions of Paul and the two collections of Paul, of course, he was unaware of the Marcionite collection. And because the flight took quite a number of hours, so we had a good chat about the two collections of Paul. And he then asked me in between and said, well, I can see the point historically that you're making, but is that not a problem for me as a Christian believer? Because if the 14-letter collection of Paul is God's word, so what shall I do with the 10-letter collection? And then I referred back to, I said, some of my students have expressed similar problems, right? How do I deal with a Christian belief and relate that to historical experience? And I said to him, one way is that one can differentiate, I think, between a historical and a critical reflection on what we discover. And the second part is how and in which way do I relate to a set of texts, which for me then becomes relevant in life and is the hook on which I'm hanging my ethical experience and so forth. So this is a differentiation one can make. And his wise response was, yes, he can see that. And he said to me, but you also have to understand, having that tradition and experience from Kazakhstan and across Russia, one becomes skeptical about every rational explanations, because we have light upon everything. And we don't trust anybody. And I said, okay, that's a good start. And I have to tell you, I even don't trust myself. And that's scholarship. So if we start from that baseline, I think that we can do something together. And we can even experience what we do experience and then move on. So first set our own critical minds to what we see and what we think we don't see. Then experience our rational argument, not trusting anybody except our distrust. And then once we come to an explanation, we then still have to differentiate between our scholarly results and a personal attachment and engagement and a religious affiliation. And so in a few hours, we got to some kind of agreement that, yes, what we're doing here today, also in this lecture or in this seminar, is not a threat to anybody's belief. On the contrary, it is a threat to every lie and to everybody who wants to disinform us. And what we are doing here, and it's beautiful that we are at least 3 people here, it is that we are not simply trusting ourselves, but that we try to be critical of all 3 of us and of everything we try to explain. And that's why it's so important that you engage with us. You have your views, we have 3 views, and we try to be as honest and as transparent as we can be. So that was my preface. Sorry, but I was so engaged yesterday, and it made me so much thinking about how we do it and what we do, because I do know it is of utmost importance to so many people around this globe. Now, again, we have 2 different versions. As we have only 10 letters in Marcion's collection versus 14 letters, we also have, even for these 10 letters, mostly less text than we have within the 14-letter collection of these letters. And we can see that straight when we look at chapter 12 with the opening, without even reading it. You can see on the right side is the canonical text and the 14-letter collection. In the left row, it is a bit like a cheesecake from Switzerland. We have a lot of holes. No surprise that Irenaeus thought that Marcion was a cheesemonger who was selling nothing but air. That is not absolutely true. We will see, because what is the air that is missing? And you will see the term air is very important, because most of the air which is missing in Marcion is air, is spiritus. So if you take the view that Marcion's text was the earlier one, let's say the less airy one, the drier one, Irenaeus has blown up this text, put much more air into it, and you will see he has plastered the Holy Spirit almost all over the place, particularly in this chapter 12. We go for a first read, and I'm reading Marcion's version so that you get an impression whether or not this is a text, as we have reconstructed this, a text in its entirety, or whether there's really something missing which you only find in the canonical text. And then we read in parallel to text versions, and I will highlight what is the view of Marcion and what is the different explanation and the corrections, the additions that the canonical text has brought in. And of course, as always, my 2 fellow colleagues will jump in whenever they think I'm on the wrong track, or there's other things to say. So it all starts with a headline, and you will remember we had other headlines, so it's quite typical for the Marcionite text to be discursive and very structured, and also very straightforward. This time, chapter 12 is about spiritual things. So, concerning now spiritual things, brothers and sisters, I do not wish you to be ignorant. You know that there are divisions of gifts. And we need to move a bit. To this one, through the Spirit, a word of wisdom has been given. To another, a word of knowledge. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, a gift of healings. To another, of powers. To another, prophecy. And to another, discernment of spirits. And to another, speaking in tongues. To another, translation of what has been spoken in tongues. For just as the body is one, and it has many members, but all members of the body of one person, though being many, are one body, so also Christ. For the body is not one member, but many. But now God has placed the members, each one of them, into the body just as he wished. Now if all were one member, where's the body? So there are many members, yet there is one body. But God has united the body, and you are Christ's body, you're members of a part. The Lord appointed in the church both apostles and prophets. Are all apostles, all prophets? To the better gifts I show surpassing weight to you. So far, the chapter 12. So you can see there's a straightforward line of thoughts. It all starts about the gifts of spirit and the great idea that he is proposing here. Yes, we have different gifts, but all are part of one body. And this is a body of Christ to which every member belongs. Amongst the gifts, there is a range of different gifts. And if you take those gifts, you see there are important ones always mentioned in the beginning, which is wisdom and knowledge. And then come faith. So we have wisdom, knowledge, and faith. And then comes healings. Then comes powers with prophecy, discernment of spirits even, and speaking in tongues with a complementary part of translation of speaking in tongues. Let me start with the last ones here, which are all taken over, as you can see, by the canonical redactors. As we had discussed it in the previous chapters, we have seen the Marcionite Paul, the pre-canonical Paul, is rather skeptical about speaking in tongues. And we will have it back and further developed in the chapters 13 and even more 14, as we'll see. And you can see here, speaking in tongues is linked to a translation of speaking in tongues, because that was one of the conditions. He was skeptical because he says prophecy is clear. It's a rational thing. People understand what the prophets are saying and what they are referring to. Speaking in tongues for him was more problematic because he says speaking in tongues per se is almost unacceptable because people don't understand what is being meant by those words. Hence, it needs the translator for the speaking of tongues. And that's why he much prefers prophecy in comparison to speaking of tongues.
Can I ask a couple of questions on that
Of course.
point? The first is that more of a comment, which I've always enjoyed this passage, particularly in the charismatic backgrounds that I used to be part of, because lots of people would pray for the gift in tongues, but I never remember there being an altar call for someone to pray for the gift of translation of tongues, which I think has always been a really interesting outworking of this passage in Christian communities. But if I might ask you specifically, what do you think Paul, in either text, canonical or pre-canonical text, means by tongues? Is he referring to shilabalabala shikamana honda, or is he referring to bonjour ça va? Is it real language made spiritual language? What do you think what do you think he's getting across here?
If you take the audience as the start, then whether you speak French, Egyptian, Chinese, or Babalaba doesn't make any difference. Because for the person who doesn't understand Chinese, for him, Babalaba is as Chinese as it is Egyptian. So I think we shouldn't come with our polyglot understanding of languages. Yeah. So the difference between language and tongues is very small for the audience. And as you can see here, the emphasis of translation applies similarly to both. If you have Babalaba without giving any meaning, then it is what he would criticize as something unacceptable, because it doesn't, as he says then, as it does not build up the community. It disrupts it, because it seems to be an important way of talking, but importance is linked to content and not just to sound, and not by raising the voice or by diminishing the voice. You make an impression. Yeah. Even though people might look very impressive if they talk for 2 hours like Trump, Babalaba, but when you then fact check, or when you think what's the meaning of what's being said, it is not the meaning that is being said. So it even applies to very irrational language. The nonsense, I think that's very important. The nonsense does not simply come out if things are not understood. The nonsense also comes out if what is being understood is wrongly understood, or rightly understood, it means nonsense.
That's fascinating, because I think that one of the other reasons I'm so interested in tongues in both recensions of Paul is because, like the resurrection, it's also something that in early Christian texts is mutually inclusive with Paul knowing Paul's texts. So if an apostolic father or one of early Christian texts knows Paul, then they usually know tongues. But if they don't know Paul, then they don't know tongues.
Precisely.
Right. And so you think about Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement, Shepherd of Hermas. This is not a big deal for them. But who does mention it? Irenaeus. And so, like the resurrection, there's this constant linking together. If there's Paul, there's Pauline theologies. And if there's no Paul, then these other core theologies or practices just have gone away.
And we will even see, and we will even see today that this type of a critical view of speaking in tongues of the Marcionite Paul is reduced in criticism and on the canonical level. On the canonical level, Paul is even made to say he is speaking in tongues, which is missing in the Marcionite version. So it is an uplifting of the idea that we should speak in tongues and can speak in tongues with or without translator. That falls almost away in certain passages on the canonical level, whereas it is central and core to the pre-canonical level, to Marcion's level. So we see an increase in the idea of speaking in tongues as part of the gifts and as part of Christian way of lives. And that's why it is so interesting when you talk about the Apostolic Fathers. The Paul that the Apostolic Fathers read is an already canonically revised version of the Marcionite Paul. That's something which I came across when I did the reconstruction of the Marcionite Paul and compared that to the literature that we have from the 2nd century. 99% of the authors who are dealing with Paul, either discussing him openly or just referring to him without making it explicit, 99% they refer to a canonically revised version of the Marcionite Paul. So the Marcionite Paul is not the Paul that made its way into the broader views of people in the 2nd century and later on, which is an interesting phenomenon because we are not yet in the process of having a canonical collection, but we have a 10-letter collection, which in a first revision, apparently, was revised by the people who then revised the same 10 letters again and broadened it into a 14-letter collection.
I have a question, and maybe because I wasn't here earlier when you guys were meeting to change the translation a little bit, but speaking in tongues in 1210, in the Marcionite, speaking in tongues in the canonicals, it's families of languages. I'm just looking at your Greek reconstruction or the team's Greek reconstruction, and I see gene in Greek, gene glosson, and I see genera in Tertullian. So I'm wondering, is families of languages still applicable, or what was the thought with speaking as a way of rendering gene, or is there a different word that's being rendered there?
No, I think it's the idea that genere means types of tongues. Yeah, so different kinds of words, different kinds of languages. That's why I was saying we could keep to families of languages, but the problem is with the modern reader, they will read families of languages like what you get on Duolingo, where you can choose between A and B and C.
Right.
Whereas it encompasses that, but it also encompasses the bubbly bub. Yeah.
Okay.
And so we need to, maybe we have to do a footnote, to explain why we come up with this type of translation.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank
you. Yeah, I think we could go back and do a comparative reading. Pretty much from the start, you can see the canonical text takes over the pre-canonical text of Marcion, or vice versa, the way you want to construct the dependency. But then, if the canonical text is a revision, you can see that it is quickly broadening it. So you know that when you were Gentiles, you were led away toward mute idols, however you were led. It is interesting in two ways. First of all, with the you know, we have an emphatic address to the audience. And this is a stylistic element which we have numerously in the canonical tradition. Because, as I said earlier on, the Marcionite Paul is a discursive Paul. Rarely he addresses his audience directly. He does it at times, but seldomly. In the canonical text, it is almost instantaneously. As soon as the redactor comes in, the first thing he does is to address the audience, like here. So instantaneously after we have, you do not wish to be ignorant, you know that, which is more in a discursive mood. This is being picked up straight away to say, you know that when you were Gentiles. So it's a different even language construction here. So you know that when we were Gentiles, you were led away, and so forth. Therefore, and you also see there is an explicative element to these statements which have been added to the text. Therefore, I made known to you that no one speaking in God's Spirit says, Jesus be cursed. And this is another feature here. We have the Spirit just mentioned concerning spiritual things. It's not the Spirit that has been mentioned, but spiritual things. The canonical redactor picks up on spiritual things, transfers it immediately to the Spirit itself. A spirit which in the pre-canonical text, as we will see a bit later, is coming in one of the next verses. So this preemptive building bridges between what the canonical edition is and leading to a next pre-canonical verse is another feature that we are facing a number of times when we compare these two texts. Likewise, it is like staging a drama here, which is another feature of the canonical version. So here we have almost like a dialogue when he says, no one speaking in God's Spirit says, is implicit, statement, Jesus be cursed. And no one is able to say, Lord Jesus, except in sacred spirit. So you can see how he is performing a text here and how the text becomes a performance text. But that's quite typical, again, for the canonical text. And we hardly, if at all, find it in Marcion's text. The now brings us back, which is also an indication that we have to do with a revised text, because we have these indications that every now and then, when he comes back to the previous text, which is his Vorlage, he has a pointer towards it, like here the now. Now, there are divisions of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are divisions of services and the same Lord, and there are divisions of works, but the same God. And we need a bit of more text. Thanks. Who works all things in all things, but to each has been given the manifestation of the Spirit for what contributes. And you see, duplication we have mentioned a number of times as a specific feature of the canonical text. And so we have it here. The Spirit had been introduced, and now it's for those people who haven't heard it, it is emphasized again that this is a manifestation of the Spirit. Only now, in the parallel verse of 1208, the Spirit features for the first time on the pre-canonical level. To this one, through the Spirit, a word of wisdom has been given, knowledge, spirit, and so forth. And you can see it in 1209, maybe because the people haven't heard it twice, so they have overheard it again. They are reminded that all this is given through the one Spirit. So now we have 4 times the appearance of Spirit, whereas pre-canonically we have only one mention of Spirit. And you can see that's what we call the duplication, or the homiletic reminder of people who have fallen asleep and are not following the discourse, but need to be reminded of what is at stake. And what is at stake is what is in addition given compared to the pre-canonical text.
Could it also be said there that in the Marcionite text, there's an understanding that there's one Spirit at work. There's just not a strong emphasis on sort of a pneumatology of a singular God, but in the canonical text, there seems to be a very intense focus on that there's only one Spirit. There aren't multiple spirits. In these charismatic groups, we don't have multiple gods or demons that are all speaking, or different oracles, different patron deities that are all contributing, but there's a singular Spirit, just as there's a singular God. So it's sort of a more robust monotheism, maybe, or the beginnings of a Trinitarian monotheism, perhaps, like nascent. But I don't know. I don't want to go too far with that.
You can go a bit far, because in the Marcionite text, what you were saying, the pneumatology, so the teaching of the Spirit, is less than prominent. It is almost absent. Particularly absent when we compare the 2 versions next to each other. It is a particular feature of the canonical text that it introduced the Spirit in various places. And when we compare the canonical text of Paul with Irenaeus' own theology, you will see that throughout his work running pneumatology is reflected in the canonical tradition. So, whereas we think Irenaeus has picked up his pneumatology from the canonical New Testament, I would, in the meantime, invert this dependency and would say, because Irenaeus is a particularly pneumatological thinker, even though, and here I would probably be a bit more reluctant in saying he is a pre-Trinitarian thinker, because a number of times you get the impression he is still almost a monotheist who we could call a type of Sabellian, yeah, because he doesn't differentiate, as for example Tertullian and others later, or Origen, yeah, he doesn't differentiate the three in the way it's being then done later in the 3rd century. For him, the three are still one. And when he talks about the Spirit, he means Christ. And sometimes when he speaks about Christ, he means the divine Lord. And when he talks about the Lord, you can't know, is it the Father, or is it the Son, or is it the Spirit? In that sense, it could almost be a modalistic model. However, the importance of the Spirit is utmost in his text. And so is the Spirit present in the canonical version. Yeah, we can go a bit further. Yeah. Then we have these differentiations between the gifts. Yeah, so we have powers, prophecy, discernment of spirits, and we talked about tongues or languages. But you can see in 1211, we have another addition. And for those people who haven't still heard of the Spirit enough, they're told again, but the same Spirit works all these things, dividing to each individually, even as it wishes. You can see the importance of the Spirit, but you can also see the type of repetition that is going on in the canonical work. So if one were of the opinion that Marcion was cutting down the canonical text, I think he would do what a good teacher would do: get rid of duplications. It's not a nice style. But I think the opposite work dependency seems to be more the rationalistic one, that somebody who has revised the text has put in various ways his likes, like duplications, like the Spirit, like addressing the people, like staging a drama text rather than a discursive text. And it is so typical for homilies that you're listening to on a Sunday.
If I could add just a bit to circle back to the one Spirit idea, I was just looking that up in the sort of mini creed that is in Laodiceans / Ephesians 4:4, and the one body, one Spirit, that's not in the Marcionite version. So that emphasis on a single Spirit really is highly distinctive to the canonical version. Seeing it in Ephesians 4:4, which is absent from Marcionite Laodiceans.
And you can make the opposite proof, that when the canonical text is just taking over the Marcionite version, we take as an example 1 Corinthians 8:6, the Spirit is missing. Yeah, let's go and move to the next verses. For just as the body is one and has many members, so that's the same text in both versions. But then in verse 13, we come back to the Spirit. And we not only come back to the Spirit on the canonical part, we also are being introduced to a sacramentalized reading of this text. And you can see that the deviation that we face here from a discursive text, which was simply about variety of gifts in one body, is now being applied to a structuring of the community, where the Spirit is being linked to baptism, and where an initiation rite is also linked to ethnicities and to the question of whether different ethnicities bring in different gifts. Because here we have now, for we all also have been baptized in one Spirit. So there's a creedal element, as Mark just mentioned, which is now linked to the Spirit, introduced here. In one Spirit, into one body. Whether Judeans or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and all were given one spirit to drink. Is it the water of baptism, or is it the drinking of the Eucharist? We don't know here. Or is it just the taking in of the Spirit's gifts? So that's not explicit here. But it's clear this is a strong deviation from the clear topic that we had before, and which is now broadened into community-based, almost institutionalized debate. Also a debate between Judeans and Greeks, which I think, and we can make the comparison with the Ignatian letters, takes place in the second half of the 2nd century. We just had exchanged yesterday a few new papers written, for example, Markus on Judeans and Christians in Ignatius, who has moved away. I mean, he is a Vienna theologian of the New Testament, and we can see that even people within the faculties of Protestants and Catholics, are now moving because they see the contextualizations of these letters of Ignatius towards the end of the 2nd century, at least in the second half of the 2nd century. And likewise, I think if we were honest with ourselves, I think we would say a passage like 1 Corinthians 12:13 fits better. I'm not saying it's not possible that it could have fitted earlier, but it fits better into a time frame which is past the middle of the 2nd century. Now, 12:14 for the body is also not one member, but many. This is now being explained in a homiletic way for the simple-minded person. So it's being made clear with examples, Stoic examples that we know from other literature. So the foot shouldn't say, because I'm not a hand, I'm not of the body. And you can see the same literary feature that we had before with Jesus the Lord, or Jesus should be cursed, is introduced here again. The style is a dramatization of the text, a performance text that is being made out from a discursive text. And again, I would say it is easier for a reviser, a redactor, to introduce such a variety of features which are typical for the entire structure of his revision than somebody stripping out not just one or two elements which might have offended him theologically or might have offended him stylistically. But if Marcion had been the abbreviator, he probably had a 10 pages list of things he needed to take out every time he comes across them. So he would have needed to revise a canonical text in such a way that it is reduced to a clearly stylized text in an abbreviated form as we have it. And I think historically that is so unlikely that you can do that. Jack sometimes talks about almost a medical, surgical form of a abbreviation, which is historically almost unthinkable, I think.
If I could add in here, I'm just looking at 1219, and I'm looking at the Greek, the current Greek edition, and I'm just noticing that the rhetorical question structure is the same as what we're finding in canonical 1217. So it's poo, like where is the, it's poo, then definite article, then noun, that like trigram structure. We see it in 1217 multiple times, just in the canonical side with unique vocabulary there. But then 1219, the vocabulary is more consistent with the Marcionite text, but the rhetorical structure of the where the body, right? That sounds like 1217. So I'm just kind of show us a little bit of the process here that we work through when we were going back and forth about these texts. Like I would want to maybe propose we reconsider 1219 as a canonical edition. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, if we just could show the entire text of 12, 18, 19, 20. I think there is a good reason for potentially taking out from the pre-canonical text 19 and 20. Yeah, I think overall, because of the language of the lexic, I think there might be a place for these verses. They are put in normal script, and normal script means that the text might have been there, but he might have been there in a different form. So I would agree with you, Mark. The rhetorical question here is either a canonical revision. So these two verses have been there, but are revised and are stylistically revised, or they haven't been there at all.
Yeah, I could see even 1220 staying as a summary in the Marcionite version, but 1219 being a canonical edition. That,
Yeah,
as you noted previously, we have this almost dialectic form of rhetorical questions, and here, like, we have parts of the body who have speech acts, the foot talks, the ear talks, and then we have these punctuated rhetorical questions, and it even continues on in 1221. We have more like speech acts from different
exactly.
parts of the body. So to me, 1219 kind of fits into that rhetorical speech act pattern that we're seeing.
But then even 1220, I think I have doubts, because it is a form of duplication, because we have been told before, and we will be told later on, that there is only one body. So we might have to rethink 19 and 20. But then if 19 and 20 were there, it doesn't harm. But it's clear, if the texts were there, the rhetorical style points to the form in which we see these two verses were canonical. Which, as our readers can see, I mean, this is the kind of deliberation that we have to make, between lexic, between attestation, and then various forms of arguments. But you can see the duplication carries on in 21. So after the feet and the hand, now we have the hand and the feet again. Yeah. So it is repetitive. Some think repetition is a kind of a style which appeals. There's no doubt. Yeah, we have modern authors. I mean, I've been together with Jon Fosse this week, the Norwegian Nobel Prize winner. And if a modern author has made repetition a real style of meditation, then it's him, and it is of great depth. I mean, when we're talking about different styles here, it's not judging Marcion's style is better than the canonical style. I think it serves different purposes. The purpose of this kind of repetitive style is, like in a homily, it is creating awareness, it is emphasizing, it is pushing, it is making points, and it's the hope that people get it at the end. Whereas this discursive style has a form of argument, you buy into it or you leave it. Yeah, carry on. Rather, members of the body that seem weaker are much more necessary for living, and what things we think to be more dishonored of the body, to them we put round more excessive honor, and our indecent things have more excessive decency. But our decent things have no need. And you can see again, we have almost like a moral homily to the community, where we have different people, different even stages of people, and where it is, where the importance lies with decency, I mean, with moral behaviors. There's just this one sentence, but God has united the body. So we have seen it just before, that there is one body. But on the canonical level, that's not enough, that God has united the body. It makes clear to what is lacking, giving more excessive honor. Again, we have a narrative that continues on the canonical level. It is about honor, it is about stage, it is about levels in the community. But the members are concerned the same for each other. And if one member suffers, all the members co-suffer. If one member is glorified, all the members co-rejoice, which is also quite interesting because it means that some people are glorified in the community and others have less glory and honor. So you have an imbalanced community, and this text tries to make sense that a community which isn't of the same nature still should hold together as one body. And here you can see a typical feature of the canonical version, whereas we have one clear stream, which is about this variety of gifts, which has nothing to do with honor, decency, nothing to do with standing of a community and in a community. It's about different ways how the community functions with these gifts of wisdom, knowledge, and powers. But at the canonical level, it moves into a real community structure where you have these social strata. And that's absent from the pre-canonical text. The pre-canonical text I locate rather in a school with people around the table talking about partly theoretical things, but certainly not about the structure of their community as a group of students. But that's different on the canonical level. These are texts for communities. You're Christ's body and a member of a part. Them also indeed the God appointed in the church. And now you can see the stratification even more clearly than before. Whereas the Marcionite text has, God has appointed in the church, in the ecclesia, both apostles and prophets. The canonical level adds a stratification. First, it says apostles. Second, prophets. And it adds two positions that are missing in Marcion, not just in this text here, but also in all the other texts. We do not encounter the jobs of teachers and powers, but here we have third, teachers, then powers, and then gifts of healings, reassurances, governings, and families of languages or speaking of tongues. So in the canonical version, we get to a staging and hierarchy of jobs linked to these positions and linked to these gifts. Whereas in the Marcionite version, we have a range of gifts, and they are linked to just two types of, if there are posts at all, of jobs, if there are jobs at all, apostles and prophets. And having just discussed 19 and 20, we might discuss whether 12:29 hasn't been absent as well, because we have another rhetorical question. If 12:29 was present, perhaps without the rhetorical questions. So it could have been that it just said all were apostles and all were prophets. And in that sense, it makes more sense on the Marcionite level, because apostles and prophets are not hierarchically structured and are not differentiated in the sense that, let's say, apostles have wisdom and prophets have knowledge. No, all of these gifts are given to one body and are in one body. So apostles and prophets who are of that one body also embrace either one gift, two gifts, or all of these gifts. but there's certainly not an inbuilt hierarchy as we have it in the canonical level. So again, food for thought. We might take off simply the question marks, yeah, and turn these texts. I mean, we don't need to change the Greek text actually for it, yeah, because in Greek it is not clear always whether there is a question or whether there isn't a question. But we might have it as all are apostles and all are prophets. To the better gifts, yes, there are better and less good gifts. To the better gifts, I show a surpassing way to you. And then he comes to the idea of love as probably even the encompassing gift that encompasses all what we've said before. Right. Here we are with chapter 12. I think another enlightening comparative reading of this chapter, which gives us not only an insight into the different content of these two versions, the different style and language, but also it shows, in my view, a certain historic development from a school room teaching into a community application of these texts with an adaptation of these texts for the purposes of a Christian community or Christian communities in the second half of the 2nd century.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to see you next time as we continue this journey through 1 Corinthians. Until next time, see you soon. Bye-bye.